The sun was a hammer, beating the dust of the valley into a fine, choking powder. Heat warped the air, making the distant, skeletal mesas shimmer like ghosts. Here, in the town of Provisional, life had been baked down to its essential, brutal components: thirst, hunger, and the quiet desperation that clung to every soul like the grit on their skin. Ilara's homestead was a mile out, a place of deliberate and profound emptiness. The cabin was scrubbed clean, its surfaces bare, reflecting a world devoid of touch or memory. For 5 years, since the fever had taken Liam and little Finn, she had cultivated this silence. It was a shroud she wore, a shield against the jagged edges of a world that had stolen everything. Her heart was a locked room, the key long since buried. Today, supplies were low. The trip to town was a necessary violation of her solitude, an ordeal she endured with a stoic mask. The single street of Provisional was a trough of sweat and suspicion. Men with hollow eyes watched from the shade of warped porches, their gazes lingering with a predatory stillness. Ilara kept her own eyes down, her focus fixed on the mercantile door, a small island of purpose in a sea of decay. But a sound, ugly and loud, snagged her attention. Laughter. Not the sound of joy, but the sharp, cruel bark of mockery. It came from the town square, where a crowd had gathered around the auction platform, a crude wooden stage normally used for selling livestock or settling debts. A man stood upon it, his shadow long and predatory in the unforgiving light. This was Silas, a man whose soul was as barren as the land around them. His smile was a slash of white teeth in a sun-scorched face, and his voice, oiled with false bonhomie, sliced through the air. On the block beside him stood 3 girls, huddled together like frightened quail. They were sisters, the resemblance was clear in the sturdy set of their shoulders and the shared terror in their wide eyes. The crowd's jeers were a physical force, pressing in on the 3 sisters. "Look at the size of it, Em," a man cackled, his voice thin and reedy. "Take 3 good men to feed that lot." Silas let the laughter swell, orchestrating it with a flick of his wrist. He gestured to the girls, not as humans, but as inventory. "Good stock," he boomed, the lie tasting like ash in the air. "Strong backs for hard work." The girls flinched. The oldest, perhaps 16, wrapped a protective arm around the youngest, whose face was buried in her sister's soiled dress. The middle sister stood ramrod straight, her chin lifted in a pathetic display of defiance, her eyes glassy with unshed tears. Their clothes were rags, their faces smudged with dirt, but it was their bodies that drew the crowd's venom. They were soft and round in a world of sharp angles and starvation, an affront to the collective suffering. A cruel joke. That's what this was. Their parents had likely perished, leaving them as wards of the town's brutal charity, and now they were being sold off as a spectacle. Ilara stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, a silent observer cloaked in her own grief. She should have turned away. She should have retreated to her sterile, silent home and let the world continue its slow, ugly burn. It had nothing to do with her. She was done with attachments, done with the pain they inevitably brought. But as she looked at the sisters, a memory, sharp and excruciating, pierced the thick callus around her heart. Finn, her Finn, had been small for his age, a fact that had been a constant, gnawing worry. She saw his frightened face in the youngest girl's hidden one. The silence she had so carefully constructed, the vast, peaceful emptiness inside her, suddenly screamed. It was a soundless, violent rebellion against the 5 years of numbness. Her hand, of its own volition, went to the small, smooth object in her pocket, a wooden bird, whittled by Liam for their son. Her fingers closed around it, the would condor it to a past she had tried to murder. Silas began the bidding, his tone dripping with contempt. "What am I bid for this fine trio?" "A joke price for a joke lot." "Who'll start me at 10 credits?" A wave of derisive snorts rippled through the assembled men. 10 credits was an insult, barely the price of a sack of flour. This wasn't a transaction, it was ritual humiliation. Silas's gaze swept the crowd, a vulture seeking carrion. He was enjoying this. The power. The degradation. Ilara's feet moved before her mind consented. She pushed through the grimy bodies, the smell of unwashed sweat and cheap grain alcohol thick in her throat. She emerged at the front, her shadow falling over the dusty ground before the platform. The crowd quieted, their attention shifting to this unexpected player. Ilara was a ghost in this town, a figure of sorrowful legend. Her presence was an anomaly. "I have a bid," she said. Her voice was a shard of glass, rough with rust and disuse. It cracked the oppressive air. Silas turned, his eyes narrowing. He saw a woman, gaunt and weathered, clad in grey, her face a mask of hardened grief. He did not see a threat. He saw another piece of the landscape, worn down and irrelevant. "Well, speak up, widow," he sneered, using the title like a weapon. "The sun's cooking what little brains we got left." Ilara didn't offer credits. She reached into the deep pocket of her duster and pulled out an object wrapped in oilcloth. With deliberate, steady hands, she unwrapped it. It was a pistol. Not some common rust bucket sidearm, but a heavy, beautifully crafted revolver with an ivory grip, its blued steel gleaming even in the dusty light. It was Liam's. Her last connection to the man he was, a symbol of the violence that had taken him. A gasp went through the crowd. They knew that gun. They knew whose it had been. It was worth a small fortune, more than the 3 girls would ever earn in a lifetime of forced servitude. It was an impossible bid. A sacrifice. Silas's sneer vanished, replaced by a raw, naked greed. His eyes fixed on the weapon, his tongue darting out to wet his lips. The gun was a thing of power. He had to have it. He looked from the pistol to the girls, his mind doing the cruel calculus. "Sold," he snapped, his voice tight. To the grieving widow he snatched the pistol from her hand, his fingers closing over it possessively. Ilara did not watch him. Her eyes were on the 3 sisters, who stared back at her, their terror now mixed with a profound, disbelieving confusion. She had not saved them. She had bought them. The distinction was a razor's edge. Wordlessly, she gestured for them to come down. The oldest, Maeve, hesitated, then helped her sisters off the platform. They stood before Ilara, a trio of lost souls, traded for a ghost's weapon. The walk back to the homestead was a pilgrimage of silence. The sun beat down, the dust rose with each footfall, and the space between the woman and the 3 girls was a chasm of unspoken fear. The inside of Ilara's cabin was a shock to the girls. It was not a home, it was a shrine to absence. The floor was swept bare, the single wooden table scrubbed pale, the bed neatly made with a threadbare but clean blanket. There were no pictures, no trinkets, no clutter of life. It was as stark and quiet as a tomb. The air itself felt thin, unused to being breathed by so many. Ilara moved with the economy of a woman long accustomed to solitude. She ladled water from a pail into 4 tin cups, her movements precise and silent. She set the cups on the table, the scrape of metal on wood a deafening sound in the stillness. The girls, Maeve, Orla, and Calla, stood huddled by the door, unwilling to cross the threshold into this strange, sterile world. They looked at Ilara not as a savior, but as a new kind of warden. Her face was unreadable, her grief a fortress they could not comprehend. Ilara broke a loaf of hard bread into 4 pieces, placing each one beside a cup. It was a communion of strangers, steeped in uncertainty. She sat, gesturing for them to do the same. Hesitantly, they approached the table, moving like wary animals into a trap. They ate without a word, the only sound the dry crackle of the bread. Calla, the youngest, no more than 8, was the first to break the vow of silence. Her eyes, wide and brown, fixed on the small, carved bird Ilara had placed on the mantelpiece, the only object in the room that did not serve a practical purpose. It was a tiny wooden sparrow, its wings half spread, its form worn smooth by the constant touch of a thumb. "What's that?" The voice was a small, fragile thing, a whisper that threatened to shatter the quiet. Maeve shot her a warning look, but the question was already out, hanging in the air. Ilara's gaze followed the girls. For a moment, her mask of indifference cracked, and a flicker of raw pain crossed her features. "A bird," she said, her voice still rough. She looked at Calla, truly looked at her, and saw not just a purchased burden, but a child. "He can't fly," Calla observed, her brow furrowed with a child's simple logic. Ilara's hand clenched under the table. "No," she said, the word barely audible. "He can't." The admission was a fissure in the dam of her control. It was the first truth she had spoken to another soul in 5 years. That night, the girls slept on a pallet of blankets on the floor. Ilara lay in her own bed, listening to the alien sound of their breathing, a soft chorus that pushed back against the crushing silence. The room was no longer empty. It was full of fear and life and the terrifying, fragile possibility of a future. Days bled into one another, each one a slow, careful negotiation of space and trust. The initial rhythm of the homestead was one of silent observation. The girls watched Ilara, her methodical chores a kind of language they slowly learned to read. She taught them not with words, but with actions. She showed Maeve how to split firewood, not with brute force, but with an understanding of the grain, her calloused hand guiding the girl's uncertain one on the axe handle. She took Ola, the quiet middle sister, to the dry creek bed and showed her how to find the damp soil that signaled underground water, a silent lesson in survival. With Kala, the task was simpler. She gave her a bucket and showed her the patch of stubborn wild herbs growing by the cabin's foundation. It was a small, vital task, and Kala took to it with a seriousness that belied her age. Life, in small increments, began to seep back into the barren homestead. The girl's presence was a quiet rebellion against the emptiness. One afternoon, Maeve, using a length of rope she'd found, strung a line between the cabin and a lone, skeletal tree. After washing their meager clothes in the precious water, she hung them out to dry. The 3 worn dresses, flapping in the desolate wind, were a shock of color against the monochrome landscape. They were not just laundry, they were a banner. A declaration of existence. Ilara saw it from the edge of the property, where she was mending a fence line, and the sight made her pause. The fluttering clothes looked like prayer flags, marking this small patch of dust as inhabited, as a place of life. It was a change she hadn't consented to, but one she couldn't deny. Slowly, the house began to change too. A wildflower Kala picked appeared in a tin cup on the table. Ola, surprisingly adept with a needle Ilara gave her, began patching their clothes with scraps of an old blanket, her neat stitches a map of their new life. The cabin was no longer a tomb. It was becoming a home, filled with the small, untidy, beautiful messes of living. The silence, too, began to change. It was no longer a heavy, suffocating thing, but a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the sounds of work, and occasionally, the ghost of a shared, hesitant laugh. Ilara found herself listening for these sounds, her heart a parched field finally feeling the first, tentative drops of rain. One evening, as a bruised twilight settled over the valley, a wind began to rise from the west. It wasn't the usual dry breeze but a low, menacing moan that carried the smell of grit and distance. Dust devils danced on the horizon, harbingers of the coming storm. Ilara watched them from the porch, her face grim. She had seen storms like this before. They could strip the land, blind a person in seconds, and last for days. Inside, she commanded, her voice sharp with an urgency the girls had not heard before. They scurried in without question, their trust in her now an instinct. She barred the door and shuttered the single window, plunging the cabin into a near-total darkness, broken only by the dim, flickering light of a single tallow lamp. The wind hit the cabin like a physical blow, screaming through the eaves. The small structure groaned, sand and dust forcing its way through invisible cracks, coating everything in a fine, gritty film. Kala began to cry, a thin, terrified whimper. Maeve gathered her close, whispering reassurances that were swallowed by the storm's fury. Ola sat perfectly still, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the table. In the flickering lamplight, their faces were masks of fear. Ilara saw her own past terror reflected in them. She saw herself, huddled in this very cabin while the fever raged through Liam, his breathing a rattling prelude to the silence that would follow. The shared fear became a bridge. She moved from her stool and sat on the floor with them, pulling a rough blanket around their shoulders and her own. They huddled together, a small, solid island against the howling chaos. He was a good man, Ilara said, her voice low, almost part of the storm's drone. The girls looked at her, startled. My husband, Liam. It was the first time she had named him to them. The fever. It was like this storm. It came fast and took everything. She looked down at her hands. Our boy, Finn. He was small, but his heart was bigger than this whole valley. She told them not of the grief, but of the love that had preceded it. She spoke of Liam's laugh, of Finn's fascination with birds, of the garden they had once planted in this very spot. She gave them the ghosts she had lived with, not as spectres of sorrow, but as memories of a life that had been full. As she spoke, the storm outside seemed to lessen its assault, its rage receding to a mournful sigh. By the time she finished, a profound quiet had fallen, both outside and in. They sat together in the dusty dark, no longer for separate souls, but a single unit, bound by the shared story and the shelter they had found in one another. A week after the storm, the air was clean, washed new. A fragile sense of peace had settled over the homestead. But peace in the valley was a fleeting thing, a shallow pool that could evaporate in an instant. Elara felt it first, a prickle on her skin, a tension in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. While mending a harness near the edge of the property, she saw him. A lone rider on the distant ridge, a black silhouette against the stark blue sky. The figure was still, watching. Even from a mile away, she knew the slump of those shoulders, the predatory stillness. It was Silas. He had not forgotten the humiliation. He had not forgotten the gun. He had come to collect a debt he felt was still owed. She said nothing to the girls. Fear was a contagion she would not allow to spread. But her movements became more deliberate, her gaze constantly scanning the horizon. That evening, she retrieved the all-cloth bundle from the bottom of her trunk. Not the pistol she had traded, but her own rifle, Liam's hunting gun. It was a simple, rugged weapon, but she knew its every secret. In the quiet of the main room, she began the ritual of cleaning it. The girls watched, their chores forgotten. The rhythmic slide and click of the bolt, the smell of gun oil, the focused intensity on Elara's face, it was a language clearer than any words. It spoke of danger. It spoke of preparation. Maeve came to stand beside her. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice low. "The man from the town," Elara replied without looking up. "He thinks you still belong to him." A cold dread settled in the room, but it was different from the fear they had felt during the storm. This was a focused fear, and at its center was Elara, a pillar of calm resolve. She was not panicking. She was preparing. The sight of her steady hands, her unwavering focus, did not incite terror in them. Instead, it built a strange and powerful confidence. She was their protector. She was the wall against which the world's cruelty would break. She loaded the rifle, the brass cartridges sliding home with a final, definitive sound. She looked up and met Maeve's eyes, then Ola's, then Calla's. In their faces, she saw not the helpless victims from the auction block, but 3 young women who had begun to find their own strength. "Stay inside," she said. "Bar the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." They nodded, their fear now tempered with a fierce loyalty. This was their home. This was their family. And they would not let him take it. They came at dawn, 3 of them, their horses kicking up plumes of dust that glowed orange in the rising sun. Silas was in the lead, the ivory-handled pistol tucked ostentatiously into his belt, a trophy he wore with a smug sense of ownership. He reined in his horse 20 yards from the cabin, his 2 hired men fanning out on either side, their faces brutish and dull. The morning was silent, save for the nervous stamping of the horses. The cabin appeared deserted. "Widow!" Silas bellowed, the sound an ugly tear in the fabric of the morning. "I've come for my property. The girls, and this worthless scrap of land you're squatting on. A fine for your insolence." He waited, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He expected pleading. He expected tears. The cabin door creaked open. Elara stepped out onto the porch, Liam's rifle held loosely in her hands, its barrel pointed at the ground. She looked smaller than he remembered, less a threat than a piece of driftwood. His smile widened. "There she is. Hand them over, and I might just let you walk away from this. They are not property." Elara's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, yet it carried across the dust with chilling clarity. "And this is my home." Silas's face darkened. This was not the response he had anticipated. The defiance, quiet as it was a greater insult than her bid at the auction. "You have no say in the matter," he snarled, his hand dropping to the grip of the pistol. "I hold the law in this valley." "That is not law," Elara said, her eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "It is greed." The words hung in the air, a final declaration. There would be no more talk. Silas drew the pistol. It was a clumsy, flashy movement, meant to intimidate. Elara moved with an efficiency born of old grief and new purpose. The rifle came up to her shoulder in a single, fluid motion. There was no hesitation. No tremor. She was no longer just a widow. She was a guardian. The shot was a single, sharp crack that echoed off the mesas. It was not aimed at Silas. The bullet kicked up a puff of dust an inch from his boot. It was a warning. A full stop. The warning shot froze Silas for a heartbeat, his arrogance warring with a sudden, cold spike of fear. His men, however, were not paid to think. The one on the right raised his own rifle, a clumsy, slow movement. Elara worked the bolt on her rifle with practiced speed. Another crack echoed through the valley. The man grunted, his rifle clattering to the ground as he clutched a hand to his shoulder, a dark stain spreading through his shirt. It was a disabling shot, not a killing one. Precise. Deliberate. Silas, enraged and humiliated, fired the ivory-handled pistol. The shot went wide, splintering the porch post near Elara's head. He was aiming to kill. In that instant, the back door of the cabin flew open. Maeve burst out, carrying the heavy cast-iron skillet. With a desperate cry, she flung it with all her might, not at the men, but at their horses. The heavy pan clattered and skidded across the hard-packed earth near the animal's feet. Spooked by the sudden noise and motion, Silas's horse reared violently, screaming. He was a poor rider, all bluster and no skill. He tumbled from the saddle, landing in a heap in the dust. At the same moment, Calla's terrified face appeared in the window, and she let out a high-pitched shriek, a genuine cry of fear that was as startling as a gunshot. It distracted the second gunman for the fraction of a second Elara needed. Her third shot was as precise as the second, striking the man's leg. He collapsed with a howl of pain. Silas scrambled in the dirt, his face a mask of fury and disbelief, reaching for the dropped pistol. Elara walked down the single step of her porch, the rifle held steady. She did not point it at him. She simply stood over him, her shadow falling across his pathetic form. He froze, his hand hovering over the gun. He looked up into her eyes and saw no fear, no anger, not even hatred. He saw an ending. He saw a line that he had crossed, and from which there was no return. He scrambled to his feet, leaving the prized pistol in the dust, and fled, stumbling toward his wounded, groaning men. Elara watched them go, a pathetic, limping retreat into the shimmering heat. She did not watch for long. She turned back to the cabin, where Maeve, Orla, and Calla now stood on the porch, their faces pale with shock but their eyes shining with a fierce, triumphant light. The fight was over. The silence that fell was not empty. It was filled with the shuddering breaths of relief and the unspoken, unbreakable bond of a family forged in fire. A year passed. The savage, baking heat of that summer gave way to a gentle autumn, a cold and cleansing winter, and now, the tender blush of a new spring. The valley, once a palette of brown and grey, was now flecked with the improbable green of new life. The homestead reflected the change. The sterile silence was a distant memory, replaced by a symphony of living sounds, the rhythmic chop of Maeve splitting wood, now with an expert swing, the low hum of Orla singing to herself as she tended the neat rows of a thriving vegetable garden, the bright, unrestrained laughter of Calla as she chased a chicken across the yard. The cabin itself was transformed. Wildflowers in a jam jar always sat on the table. Colorful, patched quilts covered the beds. The walls, once bare, now held crude charcoal drawings Calla had made of birds and flowers, and the four of them, standing together, holding hands. The line of laundry, Elara's first reluctant banner of their arrival, was now a permanent fixture, its flapping clothes a constant, cheerful signal of their presence. It was a home, in every sense of the word. Ilara stood on the porch, leaning against the post that still bore the scar from Silas's bullet. It was a reminder not of fear, but of her choice. She watched the girls, her girls, moving through the chores of the day with an easy, familiar grace. They were no longer the terrified, shamed figures on the auction block. They were strong, resilient, and full of a light that she had helped to nurture. Her hand went to her pocket, to the small, smooth shape of the wooden bird. She drew it out, its form familiar and comforting. For 5 years, it had been an anchor to her grief, a symbol of all she had lost. But now, as she looked from the bird to the 3 living, breathing souls who had filled the crushing emptiness of her life, its meaning had changed. It was no longer a token of an ending. It was a reminder that even after the most brutal winter, a bird could find a reason to fly again. A slow, unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest. It was peace. It was fulfillment. A genuine smile, the first in years, touched Ilara's lips. The locked room in her heart was finally open, and it was full of light.